All right, good afternoon, welcome. Thank you for taking your time joining a session on real-world deployment using MDT 2012. My name is Johan. I will be your host for the next 75 minutes. I have almost a whopping 6.5 slides to present to you. The rest is live demos. Hope that's okay. I've been doing deployment for, well, a long time. I started when I was 16 years old. Used to go down to a local computer shop after school and help them assemble computers. And of course, they had to be deployed. At that time, it was DOS from a Novell 2 server. So it was easier back then. Copy the floppy, done. All right, check. Now, things are more complicated, but luckily there are solutions that helps us do deployment very efficiently, very enterprise-friendly, and very production-ready. Now, I need to start with a disclaimer. This is a session about using MDT, the standalone solution for doing OS deployment. Some of the stuff I will be covering happen to be applicable for Config Manager as well, but I will not open the Config Manager console in this session. So if you thought this was a session about Config Manager, and you feel like, all right, I would rather go and see another session instead, feel free to do that. I will not be offended in any way because you decide to go to see a Config Manager session instead, if that's why you came for. I would hate to see an evaluation after the session is done. There was nothing Config Manager in it. No, it's not. All right, that being said, I'm monitoring this Twitter alias on this laptop here. So if you want to send in questions throughout the session through Twitter, feel free to do that. I may not have time to answer them all, but on this left-hand corner here is a sort of a brain trust. Some of the Microsoft consultants, Alex, we have Tim Mintner, who's one of the MDT developers back in the days, and we have Michael Nystrom, and they can help answer as well. So I just gave you some job, guys. They didn't know it up front, but neither do. Okay. So I brought a lab machine with me. I have 32 gigs of RAM. I'm running Hyper-V in Server 2012, and I have 2 solid-state drives because I removed the Blu-ray I had in my laptop before, and I bought an upgrade base. I could put a second solid-state drive, so I have 2 600s that I'm running on this machine. And that allows me easily to run 10 VMs at the same time. Very high-performant environment. Now, 3 pillars for the session. To be able to deploy Windows using a deployment solution, you need to have a deployment solution. So I will show you where you can download one and fully automated build a few servers that can help you deploy Windows. It's called hydration, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Then I will spend maybe 5 minutes about creating a reference image. Some of the stuff that you need to do. Me and Michael, we have an entire session tomorrow on creating reference images. So this is like going to be a crash course of that. And then we spend the remaining of the session to simply work with MDT 2012 in a production environment, adding in drivers, adding support for BitLocker, adding support for UEFI, doing all the stuff that you need to do in a production environment. And yes, I love questions. So if you have any, out with them, and I will be happy to answer them. All right, starting off with the lab. Hydration is simply the concept of doing something automated. And MDT turns out to be extremely useful to do that. So on my blog, on Michael's blog, there are ready-made kits that you can download, and in all kinds of flavors. But there is one specifically to install a domain controller and a deployment server that I will demonstrate. We have tested these with Hyper-V and VMware, but they are likely to work with other virtual platforms as well, because it's just an ISO that you start a deployment from. Okay, let's skip to that demo, or jump to that demo. Looks good. All right. To understand how hydration works, you need to understand how MDT works. So before I kick off the hydration pieces, I will give you a 2.5-minute crash course in what's MDT about and how it works. Once you install MDT, you get a framework called the Workbench. This is the admin UI. And in this admin UI, you simply do 5 things to get going with deployment. Number 1 is you create a folder. They call it deployment shares. In that folder, in that deployment share, you start to pour in content. That's number 2. And content could be applications. It could be an Adobe application, Adobe Reader, which is installed through a bunch of silent command line switches. It could be a VB script wrapper that will install something. So anything that you can execute, you can add as an application in here, and, well, then you have an application. You add in operating systems, everything from Windows 8 back to Windows, God forbid, XP still. You add in drivers, and that's content. Once you have the folder, once you have the content, you create a sequence. And a sequence is simply a list of actions. So that's not a sequence. A sequence is simply a list of actions that is going to happen when you start a deployment, when you hit F12 somewhere, or boot on a boot media. So for example, this list of action, there will be one action that will wipe the drive and format it for you, create a partition. There will be one step that will inject the drivers. That will be one step that actually takes your OS image and applies it to the disk. It will be one step that will run Windows Update. There will be one step that actually installs the applications, or whatever you need to do. So just an action list of stuff that happens. Once you have the folder, you have the content, you have the sequence, you configure the settings. And settings in MDT is simply a text file. It can be reached in 2 locations. Either you right-click your deployment share, go Properties, and you go Rules, and you will see the content of the text file. You can also find it in the file system, in the control folder. There is a custom settings in the file, same information. I usually use Notepad to edit this, but you can edit it from the Properties field as well. This file is simply controlling the settings and the behavior of the deployment wizard that I will show you shortly. So content, well, folder content, sequence, settings, and the final piece is that you update the deployment share. Once you do that, you get boot images. Those boot images you can put on a CD, a USB stick, or you can open up Windows Deployment Services, and you can take the boot image from MDT and you can add it as a boot image on the server. That means when you go to a client, which is configured to support Pixie Boot in Hyper-V, meaning using the legacy network adapter, it will happily Pixie Boot. So I'm using the boot image I got from MDT. I'm starting it over the network. I have a few actually. But this one will, once WinP is loaded, WinP4 in this case, it will simply connect to the folder, read the settings that I have in my INI file, and present me with a wizard. And that wizard will behave differently depending on the settings file on the server. By default, if you don't configure anything, you will be prompted for like 10 pages. I have configured my wizard to only give me 3 prompts. Let me show you how that works while we're waiting for this one to boot. Back to my INI file on the server. Again, this is the settings that controls the wizard. So I have said that Please don't skip computer name. Please allow me to actually put in computer name. Please don't skip selections of sequences, and don't skip selections of applications, but skip pretty much everything else. So it's actually you guys that decide the level of automation. If I would have said yes to all these properties, well, I wouldn't have to provide anything. It would just deploy. Okay. Back to the client. It will shortly give me a prompt for logon, because I thought that should be a sort of a good thing to have. So not anyone can just deploy things in your environment. They actually have to log on with an Active Directory account. You can also use this information to control what's being seen in the wizard. Now, when I click Next, I will be prompted to see a list of selections, of sequences. But there is actually settings, it's called a wizard selection profile, that I can configure depending on who logs on. I can get different things in the wizard. So if I log on as Michael here, I will be able to deploy Vista. But if Tim logs on, he can deploy Windows 8, Server 2012, and everything else he would like to have. So, again, simply change the inner file, and that will change the wizard. So I will select my Windows 8 image. All right. Give it a computer name, Tim07. Select a few applications that I added. Hit Next, have a coffee for roughly 6 minutes, and then I have a Windows 8 deployed with those applications. If it's UEFI, I can do it in 5. But that's it. Once you have a working network deployment, like I showed you, you can actually create an offline media of that. So if I go back to my server, can't find it. Go to the console. There is a media folder. In this media folder, I can create medias, obviously. So I start by creating a folder on my system. It will be Tim's offline media of Windows 8. It's a folder. Then I create a selection profile, which is a filter. What in my entire deployment share do I want in my media? I may not want Windows 8, Windows Server, Windows XP, and Windows 7, because that's going to be a big media. I may only want Windows 8. So I create a selection profile, Tim's profile for Windows 8, and I simply select the folders. I select my applications. I select my Windows 8 images. I select my Windows 8 drivers. I select my Windows 8 sequences. This is simply a filter, a selection profile. So I create the profile, and next, finish. And by the way, everything I do in this UI ends with this, a view script button. That's the PowerShell command to do exactly what I did in the UI. So now, if you're really good in PowerShell, you don't have to open the workbench. You can do it manually. Or manually, automated, duh, in PowerShell. But all right, so I created the filter. Now I can create the media. You actually need to create the folder first before you can create the media. You normally don't need to do that in the workbench, but for this feature, you do. But no distrust, it will actually warn you and tell you that you didn't have a folder. So I create a folder, I specify my selection profile, and I do next, finish. And then I have a media. A media is like a separate deployment share. It has properties. It has rules, meaning the ini file. So if I wanted to have the exact same settings on my media, I would simply go to my file in my production one, copy, paste it in here, and now my offline media behaves exactly as my network deployment does. And I don't have to specify deploy route, but I may want to say, don't give me that welcome screen. It has to go into this file. All right. That's it. I right-click, I do an update, I get a giant ISO, about 3 gigs in size, that contains everything I had in this profile. But it's bootable. So I can go to a client, if I jump to a clean snapshot, and instead of doing a pixie boot, I will simply boot on that media. Hello. ISO, large media, 5.5 gigs in size, and I boot. You can also go to the media folder while this one is booting, because there will be a content folder. This content, let me show you one that's actually been updated. You can simply copy to a USB stick, and you can boot from that USB stick if you don't want to use ISOs. So again, the client is booting on this ISO. I will see the exact same wizard. I will do exact same settings, but now I'm using an offline media without downloading stuff over the network. So now I have showed you the basics of light touch and how to create an offline media. Now we can take that and do more things with it. Let me show you a deployment share, or a few deployment shares actually, where I have added more applications, a few, but these are applications like, installing SQL Server, installing Orchestrator, installing SQL Express, bunch of runtimes, installing Config Manager, installing ADK, a bunch of apps. And then I have a few sequences that are more complex sequences. For example, this is a sequence where I've, in the end of a normal sequence, added in steps, actions, that will make this sequence, or the machine I deploy with this sequence, a domain controller. It will install DNS, it will install Active Directory, it will configure Active Directory, it will install a DHCP server, create a scope, authorize it, and create OU structure and a bunch of users. All right. And then I have a media that contains everything. But when I update this media, I will no longer get a 5 gig ISO. I will get a 20 gig ISO. But I can boot on it. I can go to a client. No, actually, let me create a new machine. Tim's domain controller, Tim's DC01. If you don't like to do this in the UI, well, it turns out that in the download that you get, there is also a PowerShell script that will create the VMs. It's quite simple to create a VM. Run this, done. All right, but I will create a domain controller for Tim, a little bit of memory, a network, drive, maybe 100 gig, an operating system eventually. But I have created a VM. I simply configure that VM now to boot on my giant ISO, where E drive. No, that's the wrong one. Have to select the correct ISO. It's important. I can see that the brain trust is doing their job, answering questions in the feed. That's good. Thank you, guys. So again, I'm booting WinP, but this time I have configured the wizard to only give me one selection, the sequence. What sequence to select? So how do I control the settings for all these sequences? Well, ini files, text files. But let me show you the selection first, and then we'll dive into the settings. All right. If I wanted to install Tim's domain controller, which sequence could be a good selection here? I would say that this would be probably a good option. And then you hit next. And then you wait 22 minutes. After 22 minutes, you have a virtual machine with a domain controller up and running. Then you leave that domain controller running. You create a second VM, and then you select another sequence. Because the other machines are going to be joined into the domain, and that helps to have a domain controller running then. So, for example, one of the other sequences I had in the list is a sequence that will install a deployment server with MDT and everything it needs. So this is a sequence: install Windows Deployment Services, install ADK, install SQL Express, install Report Viewer, and we are all set for a deployment server. There is also a sequence in this list that will install an orchestrator server, and in fact, for those of you who are using Config Manager, a complete Config Manager server as well, with everything a Config Manager server needs. It takes about 70 minutes to run that deployment, but it's fully automated. And then you have a lab. The configuration is really difficult because you need to open the folder, you need to find the ini file, custom settings ini file, but instead of having just one, I have one ini file for every sequence. I have one ini file for generic settings, and I have one ini file per sequence. So for my domain controller, this is the ini file for the domain controller. And if you want to have a different name or a different IP address or a different Active Directory domain or a different DHCP scope, you simply change this text file. You update the media and you try again. So on my blog and on Michael's blog, and actually another fellow named Tim Nielema's blog, you can download these kits. They are zip files, giant zip files, between 130 kilobytes up to almost 5 megabytes. It's a quick download. Once you download that zip file, you get the deployment share. The only thing you need to do before you can update the media is you need to copy your installation files to the correct folder. And this is very tricky because, no, it's not. You need to go into the folder. For example, if I go into applications, you need to go into the install ADK folder and you need to copy the ADK installation files that you download. You need to go into the config manager folder and copy the config manager media. You need to go into the whatever report viewer folder and copy in the report viewer media. You need to go into the operating system folder and download a trial of Windows Server 2012 or a full version of Server 2012 and copy to that folder. And on the blog there is step-by-step guides. Download this, copy to that folder, and to get the drill. So the download is a ready-made deployment share. You open it in the Workbench, you update it, bam, you have a lab. You will not be able to beat that if you're doing all that manually. So it's very easy to spawn up new VMs all the time. On my blog, you will find kits that is for MDT and for Config Manager. On Michael's blog, which is the deploymentbunny.com, he has kits for the entire System Center suite. Orchestrator, DPM, everything, all the 8 products that you have in the System Center suite. Cool stuff. All right. Now we have a domain controller running, and we have a deployment server running. What you should be doing if you're trying to deploy Windows 8 or Windows 7 for that matter as well is I recommend that you actually create a reference image. Technically, well, you don't have to, because Windows 8, as Windows 7, as Windows Vista, is actually ready-made for deployment by Microsoft. It's already a sys-prepped image that you can deploy, but it makes sense to at least put in the updates in it and maybe something else. Now, I recommend to use Light Touch for reference images no matter what deployment solution you actually use to deploy them. And the reasons are listed here. It's simply the fastest solution to create a reference image. It's twice as fast as doing the same stuff in Config Manager, because Config Manager can do that as well. But Light Touch is faster. The image you get from Light Touch, the reference image, it's highly compatible. You can use that with any deployment solution known to man that can deal with Vim images. It can be used for Light Touch. It can be used for Config Manager. It can be used for VDI in Server 2012. It can be used for VMM. It can be used for your VMware library. It can be used for anything that can clone an image and deploy a Vim file or a VHD or VMDK file, depending on how you create that VM. You should always use a virtual machine when creating a reference image. Never, ever, ever build that on a physical box. Because if you do, you may run into fun scenarios. I mean, Windows 8 is really good at wiping out the driver store or the links to the driver store when you sysprep an image. But if I install Windows 8 on my HP laptop here and run Windows Update, or have the sequence run Windows Update for me, it may install a few applications along with my drivers. So it may install the touchpad application, or it may install the hotkeys application that I have for HP hardware. So I sysprep this one and capture it, and then I try to deploy that to a Lenovo machine, which I'm pretty sure don't appreciate the HP hotkeys application. And when I try to uninstall it from the Lenovo, the setup can only run on HP hardware. Build on a VM, because you can use snapshots and you get a very compatible image. I don't care if it's VMware or Hyper-V, but any of those will actually work fine. Others, not so tested. And I have some real issues with VirtualBox, so I have stopped using that for reference images, but Hyper-V and VMware has been fine for me. Now, if you do it in Light Touch, you can also very easily delegate the process of creating a reference image. So if I wanted Alex here to do my reference images, I would need to find a way on how to copy folder to Alex. And we have a session tomorrow, 75 minutes, on how to copy a folder. So we'll do robocopy, xcopy, explorer, rich copy, and floppy version. That's everything you need in that folder, in that deployment share. Very easy to delegate to someone to do. And in fact, by building reference images in Light Touch, you do get more features than if you would do it in Config Manager. For example, in a Light Touch sequence, it's dead easy to add a pause, a suspend. I would like you all to always automate 100% of your reference image, to always have this build and capture process that will install all those applications and run Windows Update and do everything automatic for you. But then we have the real world as well. Sometimes you have that one application or that one setting that is simply difficult to automate or too time-consuming to automate. Then we can simply add in the sequence a pause, where we can do something manually, because when you start the sequence, install the virtual machine, it will install Windows, reboot, go into Windows, and then pause, and put the shortcut on the desktop that says resume. Continue from here. So you can do your manual stuff, and then what? What's the next action? Take a snapshot, and then you hit resume. That will sysprep and capture the WIM file and put it on the server. Because 2 weeks from now or 2 months from now, if you want to do a change, you can just revert the snapshot, do the change, take a new snapshot, and hit the next button again, and resume task sequence button. And you will now start to have versions of your various reference images that you can very quickly jump back and forth into. I'll show you how to add that pause later on. The other feature that you get is profiles. It's quite many customers who like to prepare the admin profile on the machine and then during deployment copy it to default user so that every new user of that machine get, for example, the Windows 8 start screen that you have customized in the reference image. You may have removed some of the built-in applications, you may have pinned some more, you may have grouped it a little bit the way you liked it, and you want to have those settings copied to the new users. Well, it turned out if you do this in Config Manager, the build and capture part, well, you don't get an admin profile. And it turns out it's difficult during deployment to copy something you don't have. But when you build it in Light Touch, you do have an admin profile. And even if you do Config Manager deployments, you simply enable the copy profile function in Config Manager or in whatever deployment solution you use to deploy that image, and it will do the copy profile part. So copy profile has nothing to do with the sysprep process, and when you prepare the image, it's something that you enable when deploying the image. The documentation on TechNet has been incorrect on that part. It's being fixed, but that's how it is. Okay, let me show how that is done. Oh, there is an interesting question. When building reference images, from Matt, when building ref images, installing Windows updates takes a long time. Any way to speed it up? Yes. Use WSUS. Use a local WSUS server where you approve the updates that you want to have in the reference image. And then in the ini file used for your reference image, if I can find the server, you simply specify WSUS server equal whatever SAS server you're using, and if you're using port 80 like it was in 2008, you don't need to specify port, but if you're using a custom port, you need to specify that one, like Server 2012 does. This is the most reliable way of getting updates into the image, and the quickest way as well. Not entirely true. There is one method that actually is quicker. During the actual build, it's quicker. You can, technically, don't do this, you can download updates one by one for Microsoft. That's a fun job. And you can right-click packages and you can import them. Because everything that you import into packages, well, will be injected during the WinP phase of that build. And that's actually a little bit quicker than to do Windows Update. But I would not spend all those hours downloading updates to gain 5-10 minutes when building my reference images, that is automated. All right. So this is the share I'm using to create my reference images. I have added a few applications, or should I say, sort of applications. Well, I added in Office, because Office is one application that actually makes sense to put in a reference image. It's quite big. It can be updated through Microsoft Update. Takes time to install. And if everybody in my company should have Office, why not add it to the reference image? A bad application to put in a reference image would be Java or Adobe Reader. Small applications that are being updated like every third hour. And they're really quick to deploy anyway. Not so much. But then I also add in, well, it's not necessarily application, but stuff that is good to have in your image. For example, the runtimes for C++. Because you will have applications that actually uses them. Why not put them in the reference image? Silverlight, if you're doing config manager stuff, the client will install them anyway. Why not put them in the reference image? If you're still doing XP for another year, you can add in stuff for those images, maybe the installer, to make sure it's available. But simply, it's still a really thin image, in my opinion, at least if you exclude Office. It's just a framework for apps. That's why we deploy Windows in general, to run something on it. And you can provide options for it. All right. So I've added in an operating system, Windows 8. I've created a sequence for Windows 8. And in this sequence, I actually hard-coded in a few applications. So I've added in my sequence, actions to install a few things. Stuff like .NET Framework. So one of the components in MDT is installing roles and features. So I have added that role in, and I have selected to install .NET Framework 3.5. And then I've installed the runtimes, all 8 of them. 1, 2, 3, 8, right? Only 4 listed, but I'm installing 8. 32 and 64-bit, yes, sir. Because those applications is actually just a wrapper. So go to Applications, go to the C++ runtime 2012. I have a wrapper for it that will normally just install the 32-bit version, but if it detects the 64-bit architecture, it will also install the 64-bit one, because you may need both. So by using wrappers, you can actually reduce complexity in the application deployments. Or I can simply add them with the command line switches directly as an application. And this is where I add in Office, and this is where I restart the computer, etc. This one is a bit tricky. It's a new feature that caught some customers by surprise, to say the least. There is a utility that you can download. It's called the Security Compliance Manager. It allows you to create baselines with security policies that you can apply. Well, you can use config manager to apply it, but you can also have this sequence apply it locally to the machine, even without being joined to a domain. And it turned out that those 130-some settings that are in MDT by default, not for Windows 8, but for Windows 7, they may break things. For example, if you have NAS devices in your environment that your machines are connected to, this security template will actually require now encryption of all the SMB traffic. And if your NAS device doesn't support that, that access is gone. So how should you disable this action if you don't want those security templates, or maybe you want to have your own instead, but how do you disable this one? If I ask you guys a question in this session, and your answer is rules, meaning the ini file, you are very likely to be correct, because that's where we do most of our settings in MDT. So yes, it is indeed rules, because the beauty of having ini files is that they are dynamic, and the sequence will change its behavior depending on what you have in the text file. And in this case, I have said apply GPO pack equals no, because that action in the sequence has a condition on it to only apply them if this one is yes. Check. You also see that I'm deploying this machine into a workgroup. There is no point of joining a reference image into a domain, because the first thing that sysprep will do will be remove it from the domain before it runs the capture eventually. So the story is the same. I will import applications, I will import operating systems, I will create my sequences, and if I want a pause into my sequence to do something manually, I simply steal, for example, the tattoo action, and paste it in somewhere, change the name to suspend, and try to type correctly. And then I'm specifying the LTI suspend script, which is included by default in MDT, but by default it's not added to the add menu. You actually need to know that it exists. But as long as you add that into the sequence, it will actually do an abort here and then continue off when you resume the sequence. If I go to a client and start a deployment, it looks like this. And when I'm building reference images, I never ever add that boot image to Pixie. There is no point. It's a virtual machine. It's much quicker to boot on an ISO, a boot media. It's fun to see some comments from the audience about someone wasting a full day and then realizing that it was because the lockdown of a policy that that person did not know was applied. All right, I'm booting on my boot media. This boot media I have configured to automatically log in. I don't see that as a security risk because it's only me that has access to that folder on the server. But I will select my sequence, and I will select where to store it on the server, and then hit go. An hour later, I have a Vim file on my server that is ready to be deployed. Okay. So once I have that Vim file with the runtimes, with Office, with all the updates from WSUS, I can now go production. But when we are in production, there are more to it. There are changes in the rules. We most likely have more applications than in a reference image. And we need drivers, and we need other hardware configuration like BitLocker. So, going back again, production. Same deployment chair, or same deployment solution, different deployment chair. If I look into the ini file of my production one, it looks different. Instead of joining to a work group, I'm joining to a domain. And this one will work beautifully in Hyper-V and most physical boxes, but it may break in VMware. So why would a setting break just because I switched virtual platform? I think Microsoft did it on purpose. No, they didn't. If you specify domain admin like this, When this information is being injected into the unattended XML file, because that's what's happened when you do a deployment, they will actually add in a trailing backslash before the user. That's how it works. So instead, what you can do, you can add this. It's actually a property that is named domain admin domain. And then it will not add in the backslash in the trailing backslash, no, not trailing, we'll call it in the beginning. Preceding, that's the English word, to it. So if you do have issues that your sequences, for some reason, sometimes don't join the domain, try to change it like this instead and see if it actually works. I will come back to troubleshooting later, but this is sort of a common issue I've seen customers run into on VMware platforms. But I'm joining the domain, and I'm also specifying an OU to put the machine into, etc. I also enabled server-side logging so that if something goes wrong, MDT will, of course, abort, but it will copy the log files to my server, and it will create a folder for each computer name I'm deploying. I think it's easier to review the log files there than to actually try to find the client, hit F8, and, well, you get the point. All right. Now, I showed you the sequence for production, the applications, the Adobe and whatever I had, background info. We need drivers. I usually do a 75-minute session on drivers. I didn't on MMS this time because I had only 8 sessions that I wanted to give me more sessions. No, but we need drivers. And where should you guys go? The answer is not rules, by the way. Where should you guys go to get drivers in the first place? The answer is not a friend. Well, it could be, but vendor. If you're using HP, go to the vendor, HP. If you're using Dell, go to Dell. If you're using Lenovo, go to Lenovo. Because these guys, those drivers has been tested with that hardware you have, and it's actually supported by that hardware. Or at least they are supposed to be tested on that hardware. But they are supported. So that's your starting point. What if you can't find the driver at the vendor site? What's your second option? The vendor's vendor. Meaning Intel, Broadcom, Sigma-Tel, you name it. If you can't find it there, all right, check. Then what? Why not use the Microsoft catalog to find drivers? I mean, if I go into a device manager of a machine where I have some unknown devices with an exclamation mark with them. All right, what's the difference between a base device and unknown device? All right. I can probably figure out that this is an Intel driver for their, management stuff, and this is probably a card reader of some kind. I could guess that, but I don't really know what an unknown device is. All devices in Windows has plug-and-play IDs, which you can review from the properties of that device. Even your fancy graphics card will have one. And if you're looking for new drivers for that graphics card, and you couldn't find it at HP, and you couldn't find it at NVIDIA in this case, you can simply copy that plug-and-play ID number. And if Internet is up and running, you can go to catalog update Microsoft.com. You can paste it in, and how many results will I get? None. You need to clean it. Remove the junk, the revisions in the end, so that you only have the vendor and the actual device ID. All right, so we clean it a bit, then we search again, kabam. Quite many different versions of this driver for various operating systems, because sometimes a new version breaks things. and you have to revert to an older version. This is where you quickly can find them. You can also use this just to learn what the device actually is. Because it may give you a name back, and then you can go back to the vendor site and search for that name, and then you find the driver. All right. If you have HP, they have a utility called SoftPack Download Manager that is an enterprise tool for drivers. And in this one, I have actually configured it to show me, only English drivers. There is no language in drivers. But I have included Windows 7 Enterprise and Windows 8 Enterprise. So if I go to a model here, for example, the 8560, for some reason I don't see Windows 8 drivers. Is it because HP doesn't have Windows 8 drivers? No, they do. Not for all models, but for quite many of them. The reason is, according to HP, it's apparently a difference between a Windows 8 Enterprise and a Windows 8 operating system. Because once you select Windows 8 and go back to the driver again, suddenly you do have Windows 8 drivers. Doesn't matter what Windows edition you're running, it's the same drivers. So now I can select my Windows 8 64-bit edition. I can go and say, hey, go find my drivers for that model. It would reach out to HP and give you a list of the drivers back. This is also where you have the drivers for WinPE, if needed, from HP. And you select a few drivers that you have, and you can select download, or you can select download and unpack, and then it will also extract the driver once it's being downloaded. Now, this utility by default is using a particular protocol that most organizations decide to prevent. It's using FTP to get the driver, to get the catalog. All right. But of course, you can switch to HTTP. So you will go to the help file, and you will search for HTTP, and trust me, none of those entries will give you any information at all. It's an executable. I know this. All right, I will find it. It's a Hewlett-Packard. It's SoftPack Download Manager somewhere. Here we go. Probably an exe file. I should be able to run that exe file /?, and I should see all the command line switches. No, you don't. You get nothing. Your best friends is strings. Or Procmon, which has Process Explorer, which has strings for processes. But if you run strings from sysinternals against that executable and pipe that outline to a text file, you will see every ASCII information that is in that file. And then if you search for HTTP here, argument, force HTTP in the read command line argument section. If you add force /force HTTP, that's not a backslash, // whack, it will do HTTP instead of FTP. Problem solved. So that's how you get HP drivers. Dell drivers, dead easy. Simply go to the Dell cab file site, the tech center. They will have cab drivers, or drivers for WinPE, all versions. And they will have, for each and every business model they have, you will see that they list Windows 8 drivers, Windows 7 drivers, well, Vista drivers is not applicable for most, but also XP drivers. Very easy to find and extract those drivers. They are not perfect, but they are close to perfect. And I'd rather start with something that is 98% good than to start downloading one by one and test them myself. For Lenovo, you use the Think Advantage Retriever or update retriever. You need to have version 5 to support Windows 8 or 5 or later. And then you simply launch it and you add systems to it. And if I want to add a ThinkPad T420 drivers, I would type it here. I would select Windows 8, of course, and I would click Add, and it will break. What? You must first enter a valid machine type before you can continue. So why did they even put the field there? You have to know that the T420 is indeed a 4178. The first 4 characters out of the 7 characters, that is the model number for Lenovo. You need to type in here. All right, so you do that, and you select it. And this time I'm in the export function, so I can actually export drivers. Let me select this one, and I will continue my look for update for this device. So I'm now doing the exact same for Lenovo as I did for HP. And I will select a bunch of drivers, and next, and then they will be downloaded. Cancel. Once you have downloaded, you go into the repository that you get. You do export updates. You specify a folder where you want to have updates extracted. And then you do next, finish, and they will be extracted and unpacked. Because when you download them, you only get this. Executables, sometimes MSI files. All right. But if you go into this XML file, you can actually read all the command line switches for that executable, if there are drivers that you need to install as an application that you need to add into MDT. Or when you run the export and then go to that folder, they will be unpacked in a format that allows you to import it directly into MDT. Okay. So once you have downloaded and extracted the drivers, you would go into the console again. There are many options for dealing with drivers. I prefer the control freak method of adding drivers, and that is I create one folder for each model that I have, and to my HP folder, my 8560, guess what? I import the drivers that I downloaded for that model. And then I continue to do that until I have all my models. Then I will go into my sequence and I will configure it to only inject drivers that is matching the name of the folder. Because when you start the deployment of a machine, what it will do is a gather process. It will run a gather script. It's actually a VB script, but I wrapped it in a batch file because it's quicker to type. So when you do a deployment, MDT actually knows what model is. And as long as you name the folder correctly, you will have a mapping. And MDT will use only those drivers that is in that folder, instead of trying to do a magic plug-and-play ID scanning that may or may not work. For this to work on the server, you need to do one more thing. You need to go into the inject drivers action, and you need to disable plug-and-play. This means disable plug-and-play. And you need to select nothing here, because that means only use the stuff from the matching folder. If you have everything here, all drivers, it will take what it finds in the folder and all the other folders. So make sure you select nothing here. Now, what's the problem with using a model name variable and making sure that I have a matching folder name here. Well, turns out not all vendors are created equal. As I said, Lenovo, their model name is 7 digits, period. And of course, it's a separate 7-digit if it's a Danish or Swedish or American keyboard, because obviously you would need a different driver if there is a different label on the keyboard, or not. Panasonic doesn't get models either. HP does, Dell does, but HP has a tendency of sometimes put the revision number in the end, like a bracket and, AKG, dollar, whatever. So now I would have to have like 10 folders that begins with HP EliteBook something and a revision number. Wouldn't it be nice if I could have a wildcard? Turn out you can, if you trick it a little bit. Turns out that you can have different logic depending on what hardware you are having. By simply download from the deployment guys, they have a user exit script called model alias exit, which is used to normalize model names into reasonable values. If I open such script, this one is a modified version. But you can see that what the script does is it replaces, let me see here, vendors. If it finds this vendor, it says, no, it's Dell. If it finds this, it says Lenovo, etc. But then on the model part, I can have it to do different things depending on what type of hardware it is. So for example, for most items, it will query the system product. That's useful for Lenovos. So if it's a Lenovo, it will not use the model, it will actually use the real name instead. And then I can simply configure my ini file to call that script. And once I do that, I have new properties I can use. Make alias, model alias. So download the script, modify the ini file, then simply go back to your sequence on the right server. Find the sequence again. And instead of doing %model %, you do model alias %, which is now the normalized value of the model name. This is how you can extend functionality in MDT to make driver management easier. Now, of course, if you have 50 models, right-clicking, creating folders, and all that is not that fun. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a PowerShell script available that would do that to you or for you? Turns out it does. Back in the MDT 2010 timeframe, Michael Niehaus wrote one for, let me do this. Wrote one for Config Manager, but didn't write one for Light Touch. So I wrote one for Light Touch, and it's listed under PowerShell is king, of course. That's how you find it. And it's on my old blog, Deploy Vista, which is now an archive. Back in 2006, it seems to be a good name to have, Deploy Vista. Not so much anymore, but the archive is still here. So there is like a 5-year-old deployment posts. But in here, you can download a PowerShell script as long as you simply have your drivers in the folder structure. Version, vendor, model. You run the script, it will automatically create all the folders in the workbench and automatically import all the drivers into the correct folder. Really easy to revise or rebuild your drivers repository. All right. Then what? We have drivers, we have, new types of hardware coming up. 4 letters. Do you know what those 4 letters are? Yes, UEFI. In Light Touch, we can normally have a 32-bit boot image that can deploy anything, both 32 and 64-bit architectures. But it turns out that UEFI is special. When you buy a Surface Pro or a new type of Slate devices or one of these fancy Ultrabooks, it may have a UEFI, which is simply a new version of BIOS. Most of them you can revert into a legacy BIOS and still use your normal deployment solutions. But to actually deploy to UEFI hardware, you need to have a deployment solution that can deal with that. And MDT 2012 Update 1 does that. Config Manager 2012 Service Pack 1 does that. But it looks a bit strange when you start to do deployments. And to avoid trying to reboot a machine and go into BIOS and to get something projected on the screen at the same time, I have created a small video that displays the process of when you boot UEFI. So I will try to pause it at the correct time. This is a normal 8560 machine from HP. I'm booting it on a USB stick, and it looks like this. All right? Normal boot on a USB stick. I will select my USB stick, and I will start the Light Touch deployment. It will load WinP, and yes, I have trimmed it down a bit here to save time. WinP is fast, but it's not that fast. Give me a sequence, and the machine is being deployed with not UEFI. After such a deployment, if I go into Windows, the driver or the disk layout will look like this. I will have a 500 meg BitLocker partition, and I will have a C-column Windows that is, the rest of the drive. That's the default behavior. But if I continue and go into BIOS on this machine and change it to UEFI mode, it's coming. It's in the lower left corner on HP, UEFI. And you normally get a good warning sign when you select it, because many vendors still does not have full support for this. But of course, new hardware certified for Windows 8 has. But this one is not, so I get the warning. But I accept it happily. And I will save the changes, and I will exit, and I will do the reboot again. Yes, I want to save the changes. And I want to do the reboot. Different, right? After changing BIOS to UEFI on the same USB stick, and now get this. To do a UEFI deployment of this computer, which you are not allowed to answer, you guys, what options should I select to do a UEFI-based deployment of this machine? Any ideas? They are numbered from 1 to 7. 3 is it's a good idea. It's wrong, though, but it's good. 4. In this case, it's 4, because I'm booting from a USB stick here. So I will not select the USB stick. I will select number 4, which will list all FAT32 volumes it finds on the box. So I will select my USB one. I will drill into the folder having the bootloader for UEFI. Drill down to it. It will be all the way in the end. And I will try to pause it so you can see it eventually. It's a little bit difficult to see, but it really says boot x64 EFI. That one you need to select. And when you select it, It will boot WinPE like before, do the deployment like before, but afterwards, when you go into the disk console, it will look like this. You will have the FA partition, you will have the 300 meg partition, and you have the rest for SQL and Windows. So after enabling UEFI, you actually need to redeploy Windows to get that support. It has to be deployed in this way, so this will be a GPT partition instead of a normal partition. All right. We have more hardware. We have BitLocker. Windows 7 and Windows 8, the nicer edition, supports BitLocker. And BitLocker, well, you can do passwords in Windows 8. You can do that. But normally you want to have support in the hardware, in the TPM chipset of the machine. Problem with the TPM chipset is that it's normally, it's always, disabled when you buy the machine from a vendor. So instead you want to find someone with some really nice pair of runner shoes that can run around to each and every computer, go into BIOS, enable TPM chip, set the password, and continue to the next machine. Or could it be that you may be able to do that as part of your deployment solution? It does, depending on your vendor. If you are buying machines from the big guys, HP, Lenovo, Dell, Fujitsu, well, Fujitsu you have to pay for the tool, but you get the tool if you pay for it. The other one is free. You can actually add them to the sequence. So in my sequence, I simply added in a VB script that Tim wrote to check if TPM is enabled or not. Then a script that me and Michael wrote that will configure it and enable BitLocker. Then restart the machine, try again, and if it's enabled now, then it will actually enable BitLocker. And that script, it's simply looking like this. Depending on vendor and model, it will call a different utility with a different command set. So I have for HP, I have for Dell, and I have for Lenovo's. Automatically do the TPM configuration, and then life is good. So by simply adding a few more lines to this, all right, we're kicking in and we can do OSD. That meaning you can get the kits that have been demonstrated on these two sites. It's my blog and it's Michael's blog. He still threatens me by showing up as a bunny suit on stage at some point in time, and you will know when that happened, because then that day I will go to jail for strangling a bunny. But there are other resources. This site contains links to blogs, resources, trainings, videos, books, all around deployment. You might recognize the authors of the left-hand book. It's standing here. But please fill in the evaluations. As always, be honest but gentle. And thank you, and have a great MMS, and see you tonight at the party. Hey!